Hi. In today's lab, what I'd like to do is cover the basics of port scanning and how to install some tools on Linux. Up to this point, we haven't done too much with the Ubuntu Linux machine, but what I'd like to do is just install some packet sniffing tools and some port scanning tools using Linux, and then I'd like to do that again on a Windows machine. So what I did is I started up my Server 2003. The reason that I picked my Server 2003 is because in previous labs we actually installed some software that opened ports. So for example, we went over FTP, the file transfer protocol, and we opened up port 21 in order to FTP into this machine. We also opened up port 22 when we created the SFTP, when we installed the OpenSSH. So SSH opened up port 22. We also created a web server which opened up port 80. So sometimes ports will have to be opened in order to expose certain services to the outside world. The real danger is when ports are opened that probably aren't needed or shouldn't be opened. For example, right now port 21 is open to the outside world, and from the outside world we really wouldn't want anybody to FTP in. So we would need it opened on the machine, but we would need to create some type of a firewall rule to disallow people from connecting on port 21, which would force them to connect in through port 22, which would enhance security 1 from an exposure aspect, because now we're not exposing port 21 to the outside world. And then the other way that it enhances it, if somebody wants to transfer files into the server, it would require them to use the SFTP, so they wouldn't have the option. The machine would still need to have both ports open, so you still would be vulnerable internally, but you wouldn't be vulnerable externally through port 21. So that's basically what we're going to do, is just kind of cover how to detect what ports are currently opened. So I'm going to need to get my Server 2003's IP address. The easiest way of doing it within that vSphere client is to click on the Summary tab. And if I click on the Summary tab, it lists the IP address right there for me. Now, in the real world, we wouldn't have this type of a system, so I'm going to actually show you on the machine. I'm just going to right click and open my console. And on my machine here, I would click on the Start button and I would go to the command prompt. If you don't see the command prompt, I would just go to the Run and I would just type in CMD and click OK. Once I have my command prompt open, I just type in ipconfig, one word. And that will show me my IP address. We'll do this on Linux as well. In Linux, it's called ifconfig, so it's ifconfig instead of ipconfig, but it does exactly the same thing. So I can see that my Server 2003's IP address is 10.7.66.35. So this machine is one that we previously worked on. So I already know that we've got a website set up on it, we've got FTP set up on it. So this is going to be the machine that I'm going to want to port scan. When I'm port scanning, it's also a good idea to set up like false positives. So for example, when scanning for like Heartbleed, when that was a big deal, to know if certain systems were vulnerable, the first thing that the college did was set up one system that was susceptible to Heartbleed with a product that was known to be using a vulnerable version of software. So that way we could scan that and get back that positive saying that yes, this is vulnerable. And then once we get that positive, then we could scan everywhere else and make sure that that's coming back as a negative. So that's one thing to think about. So that's kind of what we're doing here, is we're scanning a system that we know has open ports on it. Okay, so now that I've written down this IP address, I'm just going to close down this console And we're really not going to do any work on this server 2003. We're just going to scan that server. So to start with, I'm going to just power on my Ubuntu machine. Ubuntu is a version of Linux that's very popular. So I'm just going to open up my console. I'm going to power this up. So within Ubuntu, we've got a different style of a desktop that's different than Mac, and it's also different than Windows. But there's a lot of similarities. So, for example, in Windows, if you've used Windows 7, you're used to clicking on the Start button and then having the little search box here. Within Ubuntu, you've got this dash home button. So if you click on it, now it's not the most responsive, and I'm not exactly sure if this is the virtual machine. The first time I've got to kind of like click on it a couple of times until it eventually pops up. But I do eventually get this little search box. I'm actually looking for the terminal. My terminal is there, which is very similar to like on here. I've got my start button, and then these are recently used programs. Um, but if I didn't see it, I could just type in TER and then terminal would pop up. So I'm just going to click on my terminal. So behind my terminal, I noticed that an error did pop up, but it's not a big deal. I'm just going to cancel it. Sometimes they get error messages because it can't find like audio drivers for speakers. We're on a virtual machine and the server doesn't have speakers, so sometimes we will run into some of those type errors. Nothing to worry about. Okay, so the terminal window is really the equivalent to the command window that we have in Windows, basically that DOS style Windows. Within Linux, typically there's a little bit more that gets done in the command line. More and more is being ported over to the GUI, so if you wanted to actually install programs and remove software, you could do that through a GUI interface as well. But I'm going to go through the terminal just because that's just the way I think is a little bit easier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a program called apt-get. It's a popular program that lets you download and install software onto your computer. So um, I'm going to go full screen so I don't have that issue. I'm going to click in here and do a Control Alt Enter. Okay, so within Windows, you need to go find the website, you download the program, you install the program from the website. Within Linux, it's a little bit different. It's gotten so much better than it used to be. It used to be that you'd find the source code, you download the source code. You'd actually have to compile it by doing, a make config install, which was kind of painful, especially if you're not a programmer. And when you were going through the installation, it would say dependent files were needed. It couldn't build because you had to install something else. So then you'd have to go and find that, and then you download that and try doing that make config install. And then it would say there was another missing dependency, and it was kind of messy. So apt-get is just awesome. What it is it's an online repository. It's going to check your system, see what you have. It's going to see what you want to install, and it's going to say, hey, would you like to install these as well? You need to install these if you want to install that, and then you just hit the Y, and then it'll install everything in the right order, and things just work. So to start with, we're running as a limited user, which makes surfing the web a lot safer. This basic computer is safer when you're doing that. Running as a limited user. So in order to install software, we actually need to escalate our privileges to do that. So the way we do that is we type in sudo at the command line. So if I do the sudo, alright, I'm not in my command window. There we go. Basically, that's saying super user do something for me. All right, so by doing that, it's only this terminal window that is going to have special permissions, and that special permissions will allow me to like read and write to certain privileged directories, and it'll allow me to install software or remove software. So the program that we're going to run is called apt-get, apt-get. So this is kind of weird. Sometimes when we're in the command window, we use the dash as a way to pass a parameter inside of a program. This is actually the name of the program, is apt-get. So that's one word, this with the hyphen separating it. So just wanted to make sure that that's not getting confused. So now I'm going to use the space. I'm going to type in install. So the install is the parameter that's getting passed into apt-get saying, hey, we're going to install something. And in this case, what we're going to install is ZenMap. So Nmap is a very popular tool for port scanning, and it does like OS fingerprinting. It lets you know what ports are open. It's really handy. But it's a command line, command window based scanning tool. I'm going to use ZenMap because ZenMap is going to be a graphical user scanning tool, and this will allow us to easily configure what type of scans we want to do. There's whole books written just on Nmap, so Nmap's pretty powerful. So at this point, I'm just going to hit enter, and I need to type in the password, which is password. I'm going to hit enter. And now it's saying, okay, well, you need to install these prerequisites, you know, the lib, svn tools. So I'm just going to say yes. I'm going to hit Y and hit enter. And then it's going to let's try that again. Okay, I think I may have hit a space when I hit enter. So you got to be very safe. One wrong keystroke and it could just not do what you think it's going to do. So at this point, I see that it actually went and it went to the Ubuntu servers and it found all of the dependencies, finds the Nmap tool, and then it downloaded everything and it actually installed things in the correct order. So at this point, I should have ZenMap running. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to type in sudo and I'm going to say ZenMap. Now, normally when I run a program, I wouldn't run it as an administrator or a super user in Linux. I would run it as a limited user. But unfortunately, certain tools need access to certain resources. So in this case, most of the tools we're going to be using will need access to the network adapters. So I'm just going to run it as a super user just to give these programs the privileges they need to access the ability to basically sniff the wire. So I'm just going to run up ZenMap. So I just typed in sudo ZenMap and hit enter. And at this point, we've got a port scanning tool. This is the ZenMap interface. And the reason that I like it is because they've got pre-built profiles. So this would be the command that we would have to type in at the command line to do more of an intense scan. But they have like different styles of scans if you want to do a regular scan, a slow comprehensive, a ping scan. So they've got all different, and if I were to select a different one, it would automatically just adjust the command line parameters. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stick with the intense scan for now, which was the default. So what I want to do is I want to scan my server 2003. So for me, it's 10.7.66.35. And that's the IP address that I got when I did that IP config. So I'm just going to hit the scan button. Now, it does a quick once over and analyzes the machine to see what is available. and it gave me a bunch of information right off the bat saying, some of these we knew. We saw 22, 21, 80. So it did a SYN stealth scan. So the SYN stealth scan basically means it threw the SYN packet to my server 2003, and then the server 2003, like on port 25, it hit port 25. Port 25 wasn't open, so it didn't do anything. But like on port 22 here, we sent the SYN packet using this tool, and then port 22 responded back with the SYN ACK, all right, which at that point in time, ZenMap was like, oh, I got a SYN ACK back, meaning it acknowledged my initial SYN request, so therefore this thing is available. So that's how it knew which ports were open. So this thing will pulse. Once it stops, then you know the scan's done, and the scan actually just finished up. So if I scroll down here, I can see that that 21, 22, 80, which are all ones that we knew. Those would be things that we'd be aware of. And then pulling down here, we can see that it identified this as 2003 or 2008. So where's our OS? So OS detail. So it kind of narrowed it down to a specific range. So if I were a hacker, this would be information that I would use. The first thing I would do is I would scan it to make sure that it's up. Once I know that it's up and available, now I know what ports are currently open. And then what I would start to do is I'd start to see what version. So I'm seeing that it's running a Microsoft version of FTP. The FTPD is the daemon, saying that that's up and running. SSH is its guess, and it's a good guess because that's what it is. HTTP, and it's letting me know that it's running Microsoft IIS. So even though it's a Windows server, I could have installed Apache. Apache is cross-platform. This lets me know that it's not running Apache, it's running IIS. So if I wanted to compromise the server, what I'd do is I'd start looking for vulnerabilities that could target IIS. Specifically IIS 6.0. So this is really ZenMap. And Nmap is one of the tools that I definitely use often. So not only as trying to figure out if a machine is vulnerable, but also when developing, just if I'm writing a program and I'm trying to connect to some remote service, and for whatever reason my code isn't running correctly, I can just port scan the destination and make sure that I'm getting the right responses back and forth. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab a screenshot of this so I can get my document that I'm going to hand in. So I'm just going to open up Word. So I'm just going to grab up by the title here, kind of move that, make sure I've got it. I'm going to do my print screen. I'm going to paste that in there. And then I'm going to go back to full screen. So I'm going to click in the window anywhere, do a Control-Alt-Enter to go full screen. Okay, so at this point, I'm just going to close this down. And I'm just going to close anyways. And I want to install another program. I want to install Wireshark. Now, we've already used Wireshark. Wireshark originally came from Linux and was ported over to Windows, so we were using a Windows version of it, but it actually originated in Linux, so I want to install that. And part of the process is me just trying to show you how to install software. So if I hit my up arrow, it'll type in things that I previously typed in. So if I hit up arrow, I see the sudo ZenMap. If I hit the up arrow again, I see the sudo apt-get install ZenMap. So I can just backspace off of ZenMap, and I'm just going to type in Wireshark. and then I'm going to hit enter. So it's the sudo apt-get install Wireshark, and it's going to say yes. Do you want to install this additional? Yep. So it's just going to go through. So I'm just going to do the same thing to run it. I'm going to do the sudo space Wireshark. Okay, so I'm getting, a message just saying that the do file has been disabled. I'm just going to say okay. It's telling me that I probably shouldn't be running as root, which is a good suggestion. It really would prefer me to create a limited user that has access to the network resource to allow me to run this. I'm just going to say okay, I acknowledge it. The reason for that is all software has potential bugs, and about a year back, Wireshark had a vulnerability that allowed a hacker to craft a packet that took advantage of a buffer overflow. So if someone was monitoring the network, somebody could actually create a packet, put it out onto the network that could compromise the person's machine if they sniffed that packet. So they're just saying, hey, if you're running this as the super user or as root, if this program would get compromised, this program has the ability to install software on your machine. So it really is a better idea to create a limited user. But for right now, for simplicity, we're just going to run this as the super user. I'm going to click on ETH0. That's going to be our network adapter. It's always going to be the 0 one's the default one. So I'm just going to click on the network adapter, and I'm going to click on the start button. And this looks identical to the Windows version. So they really did a direct port from the Windows version, from the Linux version to the Windows version. And I can see I'm starting to get some packets coming in. So if we were going to maybe do a man in the middle, we could do that in Linux as well, or any type of FTP monitoring. We could do that the same way we did it in Windows. So we still have the same filtering. So if we wanted to filter by port, we could just type in that filter address. So at this point, I'm just going to grab a screenshot showing that I was able to install Wireshark. So I'm just going to move that around, and I'm going to do my alt print screen. Okay, so I've got my screenshots. So I'm just going to close down Wireshark. I'm just going to click on the X here. And I am going to stop and quit without saving. Some people will save the cap files, the capture files, to process them later. So it's often that sometimes people will try to break into a place. They'll just let the packet sniffer just go all day and all night, and then the next day they'll grab the file and then they'll dig through it trying to find something that may be sensitive. So what I want to do is I just want to shut this computer down. Oh. Gonna hit the escape key. And over in the right hand corner, I can do my shutdown. So what I'm going to do next is I'm just going to close my Ubuntu down.